Inflation is usually discussed as a technical problem measured by percentages, price indexes, and central bank targets, but its real impact is far deeper and far more personal. It quietly reshapes how societies function, how wealth is distributed, and who gains or loses economic power over time. And while rising prices are visible at grocery stores and fuel stations, the deeper consequences often go unnoticed because they unfold gradually and unevenly. Inflation does not affect everyone the same way. It rewards those who own assets, debt, or pricing power, while it erodes the purchasing power of wages, savings, and fixed incomes. This makes inflation less like a neutral economic force and more like a silent mechanism that transfers wealth across society without a single law being passed or vote being cast. To understand why inflation feels so destabilizing today, and why its effects linger long after price spikes fade from headlines, we need to examine how inflation quietly rewrites social and economic relationships beneath the surface. Inflation has never been just about prices rising. It has always been about how value moves within an economy. Historically, moderate inflation was often tolerated or even welcomed by governments because it reduced the real burden of debt and allowed economic adjustments without overt political conflict. However, inflation also functions as a hidden redistribution mechanism, shifting purchasing power away from those who depend on fixed incomes toward those who control assets, credit, or prices. Workers paid in wages experience inflation as a slow erosion of living standards when pay fails to keep pace with rising costs, while savers holding cash or low-yield assets see the real value of their money decline over time. By contrast, borrowers benefit because inflation reduces the real value of what they owe, and asset owners often gain as prices of property, stocks, and commodities rise alongside or ahead of inflation. This asymmetry means inflation quietly rewards certain economic positions while penalizing others, not through explicit policy, but through structural design. Over long periods, this process compounds, reshaping wealth distribution even when inflation appears mild on an annual basis. Societies experiencing sustained inflation often see increased inequality, not because productivity collapses, but because inflation changes who captures economic gains. What makes this process especially powerful is that it operates continuously and invisibly, allowing wealth transfers to occur without public debate or clear accountability, slowly altering economic outcomes while remaining poorly understood by those most affected. If inflation shifts wealth without obvious confrontation, the next question is why modern economies have become so dependent on a force that quietly reshapes society itself. Modern economies have become increasingly dependent on inflation because it offers a politically convenient way to manage tensions that would otherwise require difficult and visible choices. When governments face rising debt, slowing growth, or fiscal pressure, inflation provides a subtle release valve by reducing the real value of obligations without the need for explicit tax increases or spending cuts. Unlike direct taxation, which is immediately felt and often resisted, inflation operates diffusely, spreading its effects across prices, wages, and savings in ways that are harder to trace back to policy decisions. This makes inflation an attractive tool in systems where political consensus is fragile and adjustment costs are unpopular. Central banks play a crucial role in this process, as their policies influence money supply, credit conditions, and inflation expectations, even when their stated mandates focus on price stability. Over time, repeated interventions to stabilize markets, support employment, or respond to crises have normalized higher inflation tolerance, especially when deflation or recession is perceived as a greater threat. Financial markets have adapted by pricing assets based on expected policy support, while governments have grown reliant on nominal growth to sustain budgets and debt dynamics. This reliance creates a feedback loop where inflation becomes embedded into expectations, contracts, and financial behavior, making it harder to reverse without causing disruption. As inflation becomes a structural feature rather than a temporary anomaly, its redistributive effects intensify, quietly reshaping incentives and outcomes across society. The system does not openly choose inflation as a social policy, yet it repeatedly returns to it because alternatives demand immediate sacrifices that are politically difficult to impose. As inflation becomes normalized, the next issue is how its uneven impact begins to alter behavior, trust, and long-term economic decisions. As inflation becomes a recurring feature rather than a short-term shock, it begins to change how people behave economically, often in ways that reinforce its long-term effects. When individuals expect prices to rise faster than wages, saving in cash or low-yield accounts feels irrational, encouraging households to seek protection through assets, such as real estate, equities, or commodities. This defensive behavior is not driven by speculation alone, but by the need to preserve purchasing power. Yet it has broader consequences because it channels capital toward assets rather than productive investment. Workers respond by prioritizing short-term income gains over long-term skill development, as delayed rewards become less reliable in an inflationary environment. Businesses, facing uncertain costs and shifting demand, shorten planning horizons, raise prices preemptively, or focus on financial strategies that protect margins rather than expanding capacity. Inflation also alters trust. When prices rise unpredictably, contracts feel less meaningful, long-term commitments weaken, and confidence in institutions tasked with maintaining stability erodes. These behavioral shifts disproportionately benefit those with access to assets, credit, or pricing power, while those reliant on wages and fixed incomes face greater uncertainty and stress. Over time, this changed social norms around risk, fairness, and opportunity, making economic outcomes feel less connected to effort and more dependent on positioning. Inflation thus becomes self-reinforcing, not only through policy and markets, but through expectations embedded in everyday decisions. The longer it persists, the more it reshapes the economy's underlying logic, making stability harder to restore without significant adjustment. When inflation changes behavior and trust across society, the next question is how these shifts quietly reconfigure wealth, class structure, and social mobility over time. Over time, inflation quietly reshapes wealth distribution and class structure by rewarding positions that can adapt to rising prices while penalizing those that cannot. Asset owners benefit as property values, equities, and tangible assets tend to rise with or ahead of inflation, preserving or increasing real wealth even as the cost of living climbs. By contrast, households dependent on wages, pensions, or fixed incomes experience a gradual erosion of purchasing power unless income growth consistently outpaces inflation, which is increasingly rare. This divergence compounds across years, widening gaps between those who can protect themselves through ownership and leverage and those who cannot. Inflation also alters social mobility by raising the cost of entry into asset ownership, making it harder for younger or lower income groups to accumulate wealth without taking on significant risk. As prices rise, savings thresholds increase faster than incomes, delaying milestones such as home ownership, business formation, or long-term investment. These barriers do not appear suddenly. They accumulate quietly, reshaping opportunity structures without a single dramatic policy shift. Governments may attempt to offset these effects through targeted support or subsidies, but such measures often lag behind price dynamics and can inadvertently reinforce inflationary pressures. Over time, society begins to stratify not just by income, but by inflation exposure, with different groups experiencing fundamentally different economic realities. This reconfiguration is subtle yet powerful, because it changes life trajectories, expectations, and perceptions of fairness across generations. Inflation, thus, acts less like a temporary economic condition, and more like a slow-moving force that reorganizes social outcomes beneath the surface. If inflation steadily restructures wealth and mobility, the next step is understanding how it also reshapes power, policy, and whose interests the system ultimately serves. As inflation reshapes wealth and mobility, it also quietly reorders power within the economic system by influencing whose interests are protected and prioritized. Groups that benefit from inflation, such as asset owners, leveraged borrowers, and entities with pricing power, gradually gain greater influence over policy debates because their financial stability becomes intertwined with broader economic performance. When rising asset prices support consumption, tax revenues, and financial confidence, governments become increasingly sensitive to policies that might threaten those gains. This creates an environment where inflation tolerance is implicitly higher if it preserves asset values, even when it erodes real incomes for workers and savers. Political decisions begin to reflect this balance, favoring measures that stabilize markets and protect balance sheets rather than aggressively restoring purchasing power. Central banks face similar pressures, as tightening policy to control inflation risks, triggering asset price corrections, financial stress, and public backlash. Over time, this dynamic narrows the range of acceptable policy choices, making inflation management less about restoring fairness and more about preventing disruption. The result is a subtle alignment between economic power and inflation exposure, where those insulated from rising prices wield greater influence over outcomes. This does not require coordinated intent. It emerges naturally from a system where stability depends on asset performance. As inflation persists, these power dynamics harden, reinforcing a cycle in which the costs are widely dispersed while the benefits are concentrated. The system continues to function, but it increasingly serves those positioned to navigate inflation rather than those most harmed by it, deepening the sense that economic outcomes are shaped by forces beyond individual effort or democratic control. When inflation begins to shape power and policy itself, the next question is how long societies can sustain this quiet redistribution before trust and legitimacy begin to break down. As inflation quietly redistributes wealth and reshapes power, its most destabilizing effect emerges in the erosion of trust that underpins social and economic cooperation. When people sense that prices rise faster than wages, savings lose value, and outcomes feel increasingly disconnected from effort, confidence in institutions begins to weaken. Inflation blurs accountability because its causes and consequences are complex, allowing responsibility to diffuse across governments, central banks, corporations, and global forces. This ambiguity makes it difficult for citizens to identify clear solutions or believe that policy responses are fair, especially when official narratives emphasize averages while lived experiences diverge sharply. Over time, repeated inflationary episodes condition households to expect instability, encouraging defensive behavior such as hoarding assets, minimizing long-term commitments, or disengaging from formal economic pathways altogether. Businesses respond similarly by shortening planning horizons, prioritizing pricing strategies over investment, and focusing on preserving margins rather than expanding capacity. These adaptations may be rational individually, but collectively, they reduce the economy's resilience and its ability to generate shared prosperity. As trust declines, social cohesion weakens, making cooperation around reform more difficult and amplifying polarization. Inflation thus becomes not only an economic force, but a social one, quietly undermining the norms and expectations that allow complex systems to function smoothly. When stability depends increasingly on managing perceptions rather than improving fundamentals, societies become more vulnerable to shocks, misinformation, and abrupt shifts in sentiment. If inflation corrodes trust while redistributing wealth, the next issue is how long systems can rely on this mechanism before its social costs outweigh its political convenience. As inflation's social costs accumulate, systems that rely on it as a pressure valve face a growing legitimacy problem because the gap between official stability and lived experience becomes harder to ignore. Governments may point to employment levels, GDP growth, or declining headline inflation, but households measure reality through rent, food prices, healthcare, and the shrinking buffer in their savings. When these measures diverge, credibility erodes. Inflation also distorts democratic feedback because its effects are uneven and delayed, making it difficult for voters to connect outcomes to specific decisions. This weakens accountability and fuels the perception that the system is unresponsive or biased toward those better positioned to absorb price increases. In response, policymakers often double down on communication strategies, technical explanations, or targeted relief rather than addressing structural drivers, which can further alienate those who feel persistently disadvantaged. Over time, inflation reshapes political behavior as well, increasing support for populist movements, protectionist policies, or radical reforms that promise immediate relief or visible redistribution. These reactions are symptoms of a deeper issue. Inflation has been used to manage economic constraints without resolving them, shifting costs quietly until social tolerance thins. As tolerance declines, policy flexibility shrinks, because measures once accepted as temporary become politically toxic. The system then oscillates between tightening and easing, stability and stress, without restoring confidence. Inflation does not collapse institutions overnight, but it steadily undermines the shared assumptions that make compromise possible, increasing the risk that adjustment eventually arrives through conflict rather than coordination. When legitimacy frays and adjustment is postponed, the next question is whether inflation can still be controlled without triggering the very disruption it has long been used to avoid. Controlling inflation without triggering disruption becomes increasingly difficult once economies and societies have adapted their behavior around persistent price instability. Policymakers face a narrowing path, where tightening monetary or fiscal conditions risks exposing hidden fragilities built up during periods of inflation tolerance. Households carrying high debt loads struggle when borrowing costs rise, businesses dependent on cheap credit reduce investment or cut jobs, and asset markets react sharply to shifts in expectations. These reactions create pressure to reverse course quickly, reinforcing the perception that inflation control is conditional and temporary. At the same time, allowing inflation to persist carries its own risks, as prolonged price instability further erodes trust, distorts investment decisions, and deepens inequality. This dilemma reflects a deeper structural issue. Inflation has been used not only to manage prices, but to reconcile competing economic goals that are no longer aligned, such as high debt levels, political stability, and expectations of continuous growth. When these goals conflict, inflation becomes a compromise rather than a solution. Efforts to contain it without addressing underlying drivers often result in cycles of tightening and easing that reduce policy credibility over time. Markets learn to anticipate intervention, households learn to hedge rather than trust, and institutions lose the authority needed to guide expectations effectively. In this environment, inflation management shifts from rule-based stability to reactive crisis control, increasing volatility rather than reducing it. The challenge is no longer technical but systemic, as the tools designed for short-term price control are asked to resolve long-term distributional and structural tensions. Without broader reform, attempts to tame inflation risk either reigniting it later or triggering the disruption policymakers hope to avoid. If traditional tools can no longer restore stability, the next issue is what kind of adjustment inflation has been quietly postponing all along. Inflation has quietly postponed deeper economic adjustments by allowing societies to avoid confronting structural imbalances that would otherwise demand explicit and painful choices. High debt levels, aging populations, declining productivity growth, and rising inequality all place pressure on economic systems, yet addressing them directly would require reforms that redistribute losses, reduce expectations, or accept slower growth. Inflation softens these pressures temporarily by reducing the real value of debt, sustaining nominal growth, and masking trade-offs that would be politically difficult to acknowledge. However, postponement comes at a cost. The longer adjustment is delayed, the more distorted incentives become, as households, firms, and governments adapt their behavior around the expectation that inflation or intervention will absorb future stress. Investment flows toward assets that protect against price instability rather than activities that expand productive capacity, weakening long-term growth potential. Public debate shifts away from reform towards short-term relief, reinforcing cycles of intervention that stabilize symptoms without addressing causes. Over time, this creates an economy that appears functional on the surface but is increasingly brittle underneath, dependent on continuous management to avoid disruption. When inflation is used as a substitute for reform, it does not eliminate the need for adjustment. It redistributes and delays it. The eventual correction, whether through restructuring, prolonged stagnation, or abrupt crisis, becomes larger the longer it is deferred. Inflation thus acts as a silent negotiator between incompatible goals, buying time at the expense of clarity and resilience. Societies may prefer this ambiguity in the short run, but it narrows future options and increases the risk that change arrives under less controlled conditions. If inflation has been quietly postponing adjustment, the final question is what happens when postponement is no longer possible and the system is forced to change? When postponement is no longer possible, inflation's quiet role as a social buffer gives way to more visible and disruptive forms of adjustment that reshape economies and institutions. At that point, societies are forced to confront trade-offs that inflation had delayed, such as restructuring debt, accepting lower real returns, reforming fiscal systems, or redefining expectations around growth and prosperity. These adjustments are rarely smooth because behavior, policies, and financial structures have adapted to an inflation-tolerant environment, making sudden shifts painful. Some economies respond through prolonged stagnation, where growth remains weak but instability is contained, while others experience sharper corrections that force rapid change in asset prices, public finances, and social contracts. History shows that systems eventually realign when their distribution mechanisms no longer sustain legitimacy or stability. Inflation does not cause this realignment by itself, but it shapes how and when it occurs by redistributing costs quietly until tolerance runs out. The danger is not that inflation suddenly destroys societies, but that it gradually undermines trust, resilience, and fairness until coordinated adjustment becomes politically or socially impossible. Understanding inflation as a wealth transfer mechanism rather than a temporary price problem helps explain why its effects linger long after headline numbers fall, and why restoring stability requires more than technical fixes. Meaningful change depends on addressing the structural forces inflation has been masking, including debt dependence, asset-driven growth, and unequal exposure to price instability. Whether societies manage this transition deliberately or are forced into it by crisis will determine how disruptive the outcome becomes. If you want to understand how inflation, debt, assets, and policy quietly reshape society, follow this series and watch the next videos, where we break down the hidden mechanics behind today's economic pressures and what they mean for your future.